Good afternoon. As some of you already know, I believe, let me just give a quick sound check here. Okay. All right. Good afternoon. As some of you know, I sometimes take exception to Dr. Jordan Peterson because I consider his position as taken in 12 Rules of Life to be a little bit over the top on the side of Logos versus life or Eros. And so there's a section of the Red Book, and today I'm going to be reading from the Red Book, Liber Novus by C.G. Jung, the Reader's Edition. There's a section in the Red Book which relates to a vision that Dr. Jung had of Elijah and Salome, which is related to this issue of Logos and Eros. Now, it so happens that in the appendix, in Appendix B to this volume, Sonu Shamdasani has added a commentary by Dr. Jung himself. These are few and far between, these commentaries, so I think that this one is important. And this relates to the section of the Red Book which is called Mysterium and Counter, and also instructions, and finally to instruction, and finally to resolution, which is the end of Liber Primus, the first part of the Red Book. So I thought that this appendix is important for us, especially in the context of our current issues in the world related to masculine and feminine, and I thought it is important to read it to you today. So this is, and below this video, I have placed the page numbers for both the Reader's Edition and the main folio volume of the Red Book, so that you can follow along with me if you wish to. I am currently on page 562 of the Reader's Edition, and this it corresponds to pages 174 to 183 of the Reader's Edition, and to folio volume 245 to 248. That's the part that begins with Mysterium and Counter. So now, beginning with page 562, Appendix B, Commentaries, Age, Male, Enantiodromia of the Life Type. It is difficult to force this image to make a statement, yet it is so allegorical that it ought to speak. It differs from the earlier experiences in that it is more witnessed than experienced. For that matter, all the images that I have placed under the title Mystery Play are rather more allegorical than actual experiences. They are certainly not intended allegories. They have not been consciously contrived to depict experience in either veiled or even fantastic terms. Rather, they appeared as visions. It was not until I reworked them later that I realized more and more that they could in no way be compared with the experiences portrayed in the other chapters. These images apparently are portrayals of personified unconscious thoughts. That follows from their imagistic manner. They also called for more reflection and interpretation than the other experiences, to which I could not do justice with cogitation. because they were quite simply experiences. The images of the mystery play, on the other hand, personify principles accessible to thinking and intellectual understanding, and their allegorical manner accordingly also invites such an attempt at explanation. The action is set in a dark earthly depth, evidently an allegorical representation of the inner depths beneath the extension of the bright space of consciousness, or the psychic field of vision. Sinking into such a depth corresponds to averting the mental gaze from outer things and focusing it on the inner dark depths. Gazing at the darkness to some extent animates the previously dark background. Since gazing at the darkness occurs without conscious expectation, the inanimate psychic background has an opportunity to let its contents appear, undisturbed by conscious assumptions. The preceding experiences indicated that strong psychic movements were present that consciousness could not grasp. Two figures, the old sage and the young maiden, step into the field of vision, unexpectedly for consciousness, but characteristic of the mythological spirit upon which consciousness rests. This confirmation is an image that forever recurs in the human spirit. The old man represents a spiritual principle that could be designated as Logos, and the maiden represents an unspiritual principle of feeling that could be called Eros. A descendant of Logos is Nous, the intellect, which has done away with the commingling of feeling, presentment, and sensation. In contrast, the Logos contains this commingling. But it is not the product of such blending, or else it would be a lower animalistic psychic activity. Yet it masters the blend, so that the four fundamental activities of the soul become subordinate to its principle. It is an independent principle of form that means understanding, insight, foresight, legislation, and wisdom. The figure of an old prophet is therefore a fitting allegory for this principle, since the prophetic spirit unites in itself all these qualities. In contrast, Eros is a principle that contains a commingling of all the fundamental activities of the soul, just as much as it masters them, although its purpose is completely different. It is not form-giving, but form-fulfilling. It is the wine that will be poured into the vessel. It is not the bed and direction of the stream, but the impetuous water flowing in it. Eros is desire, longing. Eros is desire, longing, force, exuberance, pleasure, suffering. Where Eros is ordering and insistence, that was misread. Where Logos is ordering and insistence, Eros is dissolution and movement. They are two fundamental psychic powers that form a pair of opposites, each one requiring the other. The old prophet expresses persistence, but the young maiden denotes movement. Their impersonal essence is expressed by the fact that they are figures belonging to general human history. They do not belong to a person, but have been a spiritual content but have been a spiritual content of the world's peoples since time immemorial. Everyone has them, and therefore these figures recur in the work of thinkers and poets. Such primordial images have a secret power that works just as much on human reason as on the soul. Wherever they appear, they stir something linked with the mysterious, the long gone, and heavy with foreboding. A string sounds whose vibration reverberates in every man's chest. A string sounds whose vibration reverberates in every man's breast. These primordial images dwell in everyone as they are the property of all mankind. This secret power is like a spell, like magic, and causes elevation just as much as seduction. It is characteristic of primordial images that they take hold of man where he is utterly human, and a power seizes him as if the bustling throng were pushing him. And this happens even if individual understanding and feeling rise up against it. What is the power of the individual against the voice of the whole people in him? He is entranced, possessed, and consumed. Nothing makes his effect clearer than the serpent. It signifies everything dangerous and everything bad, everything nocturnal and uncanny, which adheres to Logos as well as to Eros, so long as they can work as the dark and unrecognized principles of the unconscious spirit. The house represents a fixed abode, which indicates that Logos and Eros have permanent residence in us. Salome is represented as the daughter of Elijah, thus expressing the order of succession. The prophet is her producer. She emanates from him. The fact that she is assigned to him as a daughter indicates a subordination of Eros to Logos. Although this relation is very frequent, as manifested by the constancy of this primordial image, it is nevertheless a special case that possesses no general validity. For if these were two opposed principles, one could not arise from the other and thus depend on it. Salome is hence apparently no complete correct embodiment of Eros, but a variety of the same. This supposition is later confirmed. That she is actually an incorrect allegory for Eros also stems from the fact that she is blind. Eros is not blind, since he regulates, just as well as Logos does, all fundamental activities of the soul. The blindness indicates her incompleteness and the absence of an essential quality. By virtue of her shortcoming, she depends upon her father. The indistinct glittering walls of the hall point to something unrecognized, perhaps something valuable that wakens curiosity and attracts attention. In this manner, creative involvement is woven even deeper into the image, so that even greater animation of the dark background becomes possible. Such enhanced attention gives rise to the image of an object, which to all intents and purposes expresses concentration, namely the image of a crystal, which has been used to produce such visions since time immemorial. These figures, which at first are incomprehensible to the beholder, evoke dark processes in his soul, which to a certain extent lie even deeper, such as in the vision of blood, and whose perception requires an aid like the crystal. As has been said, however, this expresses nothing else than an even stronger concentration of creative attention. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining me today. Reading on. A figure like the prophet, which is clear and complete in itself, arouses less curiosity than the unexpected form of blind Salome, which is why one may expect that the formative process will first address the problem of Eros. Hence, an image of Eve appears first, together with images of the tree and the serpent. This apparently refers to temptation, as already encapsulated in the figure of Salome. Temptation brings about a further movement toward the side of Eros. This in turn forebodes many adventurous possibilities, for which the wandering Odysseus is the fitting image. This image stimulates and invites adventurousness. It is as if a door opened to a new opportunity to free the gaze from the dark confinement and depths in which it was held fast. From the dark confinement and depths in which it was held fast. Hence, the vision opens onto a sunny garden whose red blooming trees represent a development of erotic feeling, and whose wells mean a steady source. The cool water of the well, which does not inebriate, indicates the Logos. Therefore, Salome also speaks later of the deep wells of the prophet. This suggests that the development of Eros also means a source of knowledge, and with this, Elijah begins to speak. Logos undoubtedly has the upper hand in this, my case, since Elijah says that he and his daughter have always been one. Yet Logos and Eros are not one, but two. In this case, however, Logos has blinded and subjugated Eros. But if this is the case, then the necessity will also arise to free Eros from the clutch of Logos, so that the former will regain vision. Therefore, Salome turns to me. Therefore, Salome turns to me because Eros is in need of help, and because I have apparently been enabled to behold this image for precisely this reason. The soul of the man is more inclined to Logos than to Eros, which is more characteristic of the essence of the woman. The subjugation of Eros through Logos explains not only the blindness of Eros, but also the somewhat strange fact that Eros is represented precisely by the not-so-pleasing figure of Salome. Salome denotes bad qualities. She brings to mind not only the murder of the Holy One, but also the incestuous pleasure of the Father. A principle always has the dignity of independence, but if this dignity is taken from it, it is debased and then assumes a bad form. We know that psychic activity and qualities that are deprived of development through repression degenerate and thus become bad habits. Either an open or secret vice takes the place of a well-formed activity and gives rise to a disunity of the personality with itself, signifying a moral suffering or a real sickness. Only one way remains open to whoever wants to free himself from this suffering. He must accept the repressed part of his soul. He must love his inferiority, even his vices, so that so that what is degenerate can resume development. Wherever Logos rules, there is order, but too much persistence. The allegory of paradise, where there is no struggle and therefore no development, is fitting here. In this condition, the repressed movement degenerates and its value is lost. This is the murder of the Holy One, and the murder happens because, like Herod, Logos cannot protect the Holy One on account of his own weakness, because he can do nothing else than hold on to himself, thus inducing the degeneration of Eros. Only disobedience against the ruling principle leads out of this condition of undeveloped persistence. The story of paradise repeats itself, and hence the serpent winds its way up the tree because Adam should be led into temptation. Every development leads through the undeveloped, but capable of development. It is undeveloped condition. It is almost worthless, while development represents a highest value that is unquestionable. One must give up this value, or at least apparently give it up, to be able to attend to the undeveloped. But this stands in the sharpest contrast to the developed, which perhaps represents our best and highest achievement. The acceptance of the undeveloped is therefore like a sin, like a false step, a degeneration, a descent into a deeper level. In actual fact, however, it is a greater deed than remaining in an ordered condition at the expense of the other side of our being, which is thus at the mercy of decay. Okay, so that was from Mysterium Encounter, which was, this is commentary on the vision, which appears on pages 245 to 248 of the Folio Edition, and 174 to 183 of the Reader's Edition, from which I'm reading today. The next section, commentary, and by the way, I will be reading these actual visions in the next day or two, but I wanted to, because many of my followers are laymen, I want to set the stage for them with Dr. Jung's commentary. And then when I read the actual vision, they'll have some context for it. So the next section is from pages 184 to 193 of the Reader's Edition, and pages 248 to 251 of the Folio Edition. Instruction. The scene of action is the same place as in the first image. The allusion to a crater heightens the impression of a large cavity that reaches far down into the interior of the earth. This depth is not inactive, but violently discharges all kinds of matter. Since Eros poses the most serious problem at first, Salome enters the scene, blindly groping her way toward the left. Even what appear to be negligible details are important, and in such even what appear to be negligible details are important in such visionary images. The left is the side of the inauspicious. This suggests that Eros does not tend toward the right, the side of consciousness, conscious will, and conscious choice, but toward the side of the heart, which is less subject to our conscious will. This movement toward the left is emphasized by the fact that the serpent moves in the same direction. The serpent represents magical power, which also appears where animal drives are aroused imperceptibly in us. They afford the movement of Eros, the uncanny emphasis that strikes us as magical. Magical effect is the enchantment and underlining of our thought and feeling through dark, instinctual impulses of an animal nature. The movement toward the left is blind, that is, without purpose and intention. It hence requires guidance, not by conscious intention, but by logos. Elijah calls Salome back. Her blindness is an affliction, and as such demands healing. Closer scrutiny at least partially invalidates the prejudice against her. She seems to be innocent, and perhaps her badness ought to be attributed to her blindness. Logos asserts its power over Eros by calling back Salome. The serpent also obeys Logos. It rests with Logos and Eros to emphasize the power and significance of this image. A natural consequence of this magical, powerful view of the union of Logos and Eros is the strongly felt smallness and insignificance of the I, which finds expression in a sense of boyishness. Whenever we're referring to the I in this reading, I think it refers to Dr. Jung himself. But he writes it in this commentary as I. It appears as if the movement toward the left, following blind Eros, is not possible or effectively disallowed. That was U.S. Navy F-18s overflying the U.S. Naval Academy football stadium at the beginning of the football game for this weekend. So I will begin that paragraph once more. It appears as if the movement toward the left, following blind Eros, is not possible or effectively disallowed without the intervention of Logos. The intervention of Logos was just there. You just heard it. It's like my synchronicity from back when I was reading Answer to Job. From the perspective of Logos, following a movement blindly is from the perspective of Logos, without the intervention of Logos. From the perspective of Logos, following a movement blindly is a sin because it is one-sided and violates the law that man must forever strive for the highest degree of consciousness. Therein lies his humanity. The other he has in common with animals. Jesus also says, quote, "If you know what you are doing, you are blessed. If you do not know what you are doing, you are damned," unquote. The citation for that is Luke 6:4. The movement toward the left would be possible and permitted only if a conscious, seeing notion of it existed. Formulating such a notion is not possible without the intervention of Logos. The first step toward developing such a notion is to become conscious of the goal or intention of the movement. Hence, Elijah asks about the intention of the I, and it must admit its blindness, that is, its ignorance about intention. The only recognizable thing is a longing, a wish to unravel the embroilment, caused by the first image. Such making conscious stirs a vague sense of happiness in Salome. Understandably so, since consciousness means insight. That is a healing of her blindness. Thus a step toward attaining the healing of Eros is taken. At first, the I remains in its inferior position, since its ignorance prevents it from surveying the further development of its problem, nor would it know which direction to take, since it has never cast its gaze into the depths of its psychic substratum, but has seen only what meets the eye and recognized only the powers of consciousness and the conscious world as effective forces, half-consciously denying its inner impulses. Faced with its own depths, such an eye can only feel embarrassed. Its belief in a conscious upper world had been so firm that going down into the depths of the self is like guilt, a betrayal of conscious ideals. But since its desire to unravel the embroilment is greater than its aversion to its own inferiority, the I entrusts itself to the guidance of Logos. Since nothing comes into view that could answer the question raised, even greater depths must evidently be opened up. This in turn occurs with the help of the crystal. That is, through the utmost concentration of expected intention. That is, through the utmost concentration of expectant attention. The first image to appear in the crystal is the Mother of God with child. This image is obviously related and opposed to the vision of Eve in the first image. Just as Eve represents carnal temptation and carnal motherhood, the Mother of God stands for carnal virginity and spiritual motherhood. The first direction would be a movement of Eros toward the flesh, the latter toward the spirit. Eve is an expression of the carnal side, whereas Mary expresses the spiritual side of Eros. As long as the eye saw only Eve, it was blind. The evocation of awareness, however, affords a spiritual view of Eros. In the first case, the I became an Odysseus on an adventurous journey, which concludes with the aging man's return to Penelope, the motherly woman. In the latter case, the I is depicted as Peter, the chosen rock upon which the church is to be founded. The key as the symbol of the power of binding and loosing buttresses the key as the symbol of binding and loosing buttresses this idea and leads one to the image of the Pope as God's governor on earth with a threefold crown. Undoubtedly, the I becomes involved in a movement toward spiritual power, as attested by the one-sidedness of the movement. The vision of Eve leads astray to adventurous Odyssey, to Circe and Calypso. The vision of the Mother of God, on the other hand, turns desire away from the flesh and toward the humble veneration of the spirit. Eros is subject to error in the flesh, but in the spirit it rises above the flesh and the inferiority of carnal error. It therefore almost imperceptibly becomes the spirit, the power over the flesh in the guise of love, and thus spiritual power casts off the mantle of love. Although the former believes it loves the spirit, in effect it rules the flesh. And the more powerful it is, the less loving it is. And the less it loves the spirit, the more it is carnal power. On account of its power over the flesh, the love of the spirit thus becomes a secular power drive in spiritual guise. On account of its power over the flesh, the love of the spirit thus becomes a secular power drive in spiritual guise. Christ overcame the world by burdening himself with its suffering, but Buddha overcame both the pleasure and suffering of the world by disposing of both, and thus he entered into non-being, a condition from which there is no return. Buddha is an even higher spiritual power that derives no pleasure from controlling the flesh, since he has altogether moved beyond pleasure and suffering. Passion, whose conquest still requires so much effort in the case of Christ, and does so incessantly and in ever greater measure, has left Buddha and surrounds him as a blazing fire. He is both unaffected and untouchable. But if the living, I just mentioned as an aside to those who are listening, that Dr. Jung and Dr. Edinger both placed Buddha and Christ on the same scale related to the spirit, with Christ on the end of the ego or the passion, and Buddha on the end of the with Buddha on the end of the self or the God image. Let's see. So anyway, okay, moving on. Sean says that's so synchronistic because I was watching F-16s on another YouTube, honest to God, and you started narrating. Okay. So moving on. But if the living eye approaches this condition, its passion may leave it, though it will not die. Or are we not our passion? And what happens to our passion when it leaves the eye? The eye is consciousness, which only has eyes in front. It never sees what is behind it, but that is where the passion it has overcome in front regroups. Unguided by the eye of reason, unmitigated by humaneness, the fire becomes a devastating, bloodthirsty Kali who devours the life of man from within, as the mantra of her sacrificial ceremony says, quote, "Hail to you, O Kali, triple-eyed goddess of dreadful aspect, from whose throat hangs a necklace of human skulls. May you be honored with this blood," unquote. Salome must of course despair of this end, which would which would like to turn Eros into spirit, since Eros cannot exist without the flesh. In resisting the inferiority of the flesh, the I resists its female soul against spirit. The I resists its female soul, which represents everything that strives to suppress consciousness, against spirit. Thus, this path also results in an opposition. Hence, the I returns from beholding the figures embodying its conflict. Logos and Eros are reunited as if they had overcome the conflict between spirit and flesh. They appear to know the solution. The movement toward the left, which started from Eros at the beginning of the image, now commences from Logos. He starts moving toward the left to complete with seeing eyes what began in blindness. At first, this movement leads into greater darkness, which is then still somewhat illumined by the reddish light. The color red points to Eros. While it does not emit a bright light, Eros at least provides an opportunity to recognize something, perhaps even merely by inducing a situation in which man can recognize something, provided Logos assists him. Elijah leans against the marble lion. The lion, as a royal animal, signifies power. The stone suggests unshakable firmness, thereby expressing the power and solidity of Logos. Once again, awareness commences first, although now in greater depths, in renewed surroundings. Here the I experiences its smallness even more, as it is even further removed from the world it knows, where it is conscious of its value and meaning. In these new surroundings, there is nothing to remind it of its meaning. Hence it is obviously overwhelmed by so much otherness, which so completely eludes its own discretion. Elijah assumes control of developing awareness. As the crystal visions have shown, the idea that should be conveyed to consciousness is an idea of spiritual power. That is, the I was tempted to arrogate prophethood, but this idea encountered such a feeling of resistance that it could not assert itself against consciousness. Hence it remained behind the curtain. But since the I could not follow Eros blindly, it sought at least to exchange spiritual power for this loss, as observed so very often in human life. It is almost inevitable that such a great loss, like that of Eros, presses man to search for a substitute, at least in the sphere of power. This occurs in such an uncanny, cunning manner that the I mostly fails to notice the ruse, which explains why the I, as a rule, cannot enjoy its power, since it does not possess power, but is possessed by the power devil. In this case, it would have been easy for the I to grasp the fact that Elijah imposes himself with such living reality and lay claim to this figure as a personality valuable in itself, but awareness has But awareness has forestalled this deception. Sean Steele says, good insight on the Buddha as the self and Christ as the ego. I'll keep that perspective in mind. That's a good one, and there are a couple of videos on this YouTube channel about that. The appearance of living figures should not be taken personally, even though one is obviously inclined to assume responsibility for them. In reality, such figures belong just as much or little to our personality as our hands and feet. The mere presence of hands or feet is not characteristic of personality. If anything about them is characteristic, it is merely their individual character. It is thus characteristic of the eye that the old man and the young maiden are called Elijah and Salome. They might just as well have been called Simon Magus and Helena. They might just as well have been called Simon Magus and Helena. What is significant, however, is that they are biblical figures. As proven later, this is one of the peculiarities of the psychic entanglement belonging to this moment. The awareness of the alluring idea of spiritual power shifts the question of Eros into the foreground again, once more in a new form. Both the possibility indicated by Eve and the one represented by Mary are ruled out. Hence, the third possibility remains, namely filial relationship, which avoids the two extremes of the flesh and the spirit. Elijah as the father, Salome as the sister, the I as the son and brother. This solution corresponds to the Christian notion of childhood in God. Salome as Mary makes up the as yet absent mother in what is makes up the as yet absent mother in what is a formidably ensnaring manner. This has a corresponding effect on the I. There is something undeniably cathartic about the Christian solution, because it seems to be altogether possible. There is a child in each of us. In the elderly, it is even the only thing still alive. One can have recourse to the childlike anytime on account of its inexhaustible freshness and adherence. Everything, even the most ominous, can be rendered harmless through retranslation into the childlike. After all, we do this often enough in everyday life. We even manage to tame a passion by leading it back to the childlike, and perhaps the flame of passion collapses in a childlike lament even more often. Thus, there are many prospects for which the childlike can seem to be a satisfactory remedy, including not least the far-reaching effect of our Christian education, which hammers into us the notion of childhood in hundreds of mantras and hymns. Which hammers into us the notion of childhood in hundreds of mantras and hymns. Salome has remarked that Mary is their mother, must thus appear even more devastating. Since this prevents the childlike solution from developing, it immediately prompts another thought. If Mary is the mother, then inescapably I must be Christ. The childlike solution would have canceled all reservations. Salome would no longer pose a threat, since she would be only the little sister. Elijah would be the caring father, whose wisdom and foresight would have left the eye to its own devices with childlike trust. But this is the unfortunate drawback constituted by childhood as a solution. Every child wishes to grow. Being a child involves the burning desire and impatience for future adulthood. If we return to being a child for fear of the dangers of Eros, the child will want to develop toward spiritual power. But if we flee into childhood for fear of the dangers of the spirit, we fall into arrogating the power of Eros. We fall into arrogating the power of Eros. The condition of spiritual childhood constitutes a transition in which not everyone can remain. In this case, it stands to reason that Eros demonstrates to the eye the impossibility of being a child. One might think that it is not that awful to renounce the condition of childhood, but only those who fail to grasp the consequences of this renunciation think that way. It is not the loss of immemorial Christian views and the religious possibilities they ensured. Many bear this loss all too easily, but rather that what is renounced refers to the much more profound attitude that far transcends the Christian outlook, which provides individual life and thought with a tried and tested direction. Even if one has long abstained from Christian religious practice and has long ceased to regret this loss, one continues to behave intuitively as if the original views still existed by right. One fails to consider that a discarded worldview needs to be replaced by a new one. In particular, one fails to be clear about the fact that renouncing the Christian outlook erodes present-day morals. Renouncing childhood means that no emotional or habitual dependence on hitherto valid moral views any longer exists. The hitherto valid view has arisen from the spirit of the Christian worldview. Notwithstanding all free thinking, our attitude for Eros, for instance, remains the old Christian view. We can now no longer bide our time peacefully without questioning and doubt, or else we will remain in the state of childhood. If we merely reject the dogmatic view, our liberation from the well-established will be merely intellectual, whereas our deeper feeling will persist on the old path. Most people, however, are unaware of how this sets them at odds with themselves. But later generations will become increasingly aware of this. Yet those who notice this will realize with horror that renouncing resumed childhood ousts them from our present times. And yet those who notice this will realize with horror that renouncing resumed childhood ousts them from our present times, and that they can no longer follow any of the traditional ways. They enter uncharted territory, which has neither paths nor boundaries. They lack any direction, since they have forsaken all established bearings. This realization, however, dawns upon very few, since the vast majority makes do with half measures, and remains unperturbed by the stupidity of their spiritual condition. But then tepidity But then tepidity and slackness is not to everyone's taste. Some would rather abandon themselves to despair than adhere to a worldview completely removed from the well-trodden paths of their habitual behavior. They would rather venture into a pathless, dark land at the risk of perishing there, even if this would outrage all their cowardice. When Salome remarks that Mary is their mother, which means that the I is Christ, this means in brief that the I has left the state of Christian childhood and has taken the place of Christ. Nothing could be more absurd, of course, than to assume that the I thus would be presuming excessive importance. On the contrary, it takes up a decidedly inferior position. Previously, it had the advantage of being part of the crowd, rallying behind a powerful figure, but now it has exchanged that for solitude and forlornness, rendering it as alien and lonely in its world as Jesus was in his, without possessing that great man's outstanding attributes. Being at odds with the world requires greatness, but the I experiences its almost ludicrous meagerness, which explains its horror at Salome's revelations. Whoever steps beyond the Christian outlook, yet does so definitely, falls into a seeming abyss and utmost solitude, and lacks any means of hiding the fact. Of course, one would like to persuade oneself that this is not all that bad, but it is. Abandonment is about the worst thing that can happen to man's herd instinct, not to mention the daunting task with which we thus burden ourselves. Destruction is easy, but rebuilding is difficult. Thus the image ends with a sense of gloom, which stands opposed, however, to the tall, quietly burning flame encircled by the serpent. This view denotes devotion coupled with the magical compulsion expressed. This view denotes devotion coupled with the magical compulsion expressed by the serpent. Thus, an effective counterpart is set against the disquieting sense of doubt and fear, as if someone were saying, "Of course your I, of course your," quote, "of course your I is full of unease and doubt, but the constant flame of devotion burns in you more strongly, and the compulsion of your fate is more powerful," unquote. Okay. So that was referring to the part of the vision that was in pages 248 to 251 of the Folio version of the Red Book, and it corresponds to pages 184 to 93 of the Reader's Edition. So I'm reading commentary on these visions, which is found in the Red Book, Liber Novus, Reader's Edition. I'm trying to give you both the Folio Edition sites and the Reader's Edition sites. Okay, moving along. There's a brief resolution here. And this corresponds to the vision which is in the Folio version, page 251 to 255, and in the Reader's Edition, pages 194 to 207. Resolution. The far-reaching premonitions of the second image plunged the I into a chaos of doubt. Hence, an understandable desire arose to rise above the confusion to attain greater clarity, as expressed in the image of the beetling mountain range. Logos appears to be leading the way. What occurs next is the image of two opposites, expressed by two serpents, and the separation of day and night. Daylight signifies good, whereas darkness represents evil. As compelling forces, both assume the figure of serpents. Therein lies concealed an idea that subsequently assumes great importance. Therein lies concealed an idea that subsequently assumes great importance. Whoever encountered a black serpent would have been no less surprised at encountering a white one. Color does not dispel fear. What this suggests is that perhaps an equally dangerous, bewitching power resides in good as in evil. Essentially, the good needs to be regarded as an inherently no less dangerous principle than evil. In any event, the eye could decide to approach the white serpent just as little as the black one, even though it believes it can and must by all means entrust itself more to good than to evil. But the eye is rooted to the spot halfway, transfixed, and observes the struggle between the two principles within itself. The fact that the eye remains in this middle position implies the advance of evil, since anything but unconditional surrender to the good impairs it. This finds expression in the attack of the black serpent, but the fact that the eye does not partake of evil constitutes a victory for the good. This finds expression in the black serpent growing a white head. The disappearance of the serpent denotes that the opposition of good and evil has become ineffective. That is, that at least it has lost its immediate significance. For the eye, this means a release from the unconditional power of the hitherto abiding moral point of view in favor of a middle position freed from the pair of opposites. But neither clarity nor a clear view has been gained thereby. Hence the ascent continues to the final point of evolution. Hence the ascent continues to the final point of elevation, which might grant the longed for outlook. Okay, so that is the commentary on the part of the Red Book which begins with the Mysterium encounter. That's the chapter. If you have a Red Book, you can look up Mysterium encounter. And the visions are the visions which begin there and go to the end of Liber Primus, the first part of the Red Book, and end at the beginning of Liber Secundus. So, let's see. Yeah. Sean Steele says, it feels like he's making sure we're aware that there is always a converging antithesis to a beneficiary perspective, some sort of consequence intertwined, even though it may be invisible to us. I certainly think it's something like that. Certainly in individuation, we must recognize that the evil is within us as part of the individuation process. So Dr. Edinger said that if you're going to start this process of individuation, you have to reflect on whatever it is that you love or hate. And once you recognize the things you hate in yourself, then you're in the process of individuation, I think. So, anyway, I thought that was useful, since it's very rare that we find a commentary of Dr. Jung himself that is quite so clear. His book Ion is regarded by some as a commentary on the Red Book, but you have to look pretty hard to see the connections between the Red Book and Ion, in my view, considering the fact that I'm now teaching a seminar on Ion in the advanced reading group. I am trying hard to see where the connections are between Ion and the Red Book, but certainly they are there. But it's not quite so clear as this particular commentary. And I just read it because last night I was looking through the Red Book, and I came upon these addenda, I came upon these appendices, and I said, what's this? I'm not sure I've read those. And I think many of us, when we're reading a book, we tend to skip the appendixes and just think we're going to read the meat of the text. But in this case, I thought the appendix was quite useful in helping understand those visions. So if you have the Red Book, you can look at the Folio Edition, pages 245 to 248, and if you have the Reader's Edition, you can look at pages 174 to 207, I believe, and those are the pages that have the visions that Dr. Jung was commenting on in this appendix. So just so you're clear on where I'm taking this from. Let's see. Sean says, did Jung have epilepsy? I think I remember reading he had it pretty bad when he was younger, or maybe that was Freud. Well, I think that Jung certainly mentions in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and other places that when he was young, he had periods during which he fainted. But my impression of that was not a diagnosis of epilepsy per se, but it was rather a sort of a shirking the poet David White talked about a great bullfighter at one point, and he said that this bullfighter was known because when he was 5 years old, he used to hide in his mother's skirts, but then as he grew up, he became very courageous and one of the greatest bullfighters of all time. And it seems to me that Dr. Jung's childhood reaction may have been like that. In other words, he was recognizing that he was going to have to take a position that was very different from his father's, since his father was a Swiss Reformed pastor, and quite different from his mother also, because she was into the occult, and he started to have these visions which were very graphic. I'm not going to go into them here, but you can read about them in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and you will be very surprised at what his visions were. But I think all of those things maybe makes a child want to avoid or not go into adulthood right away. And so he recounts a period of about 6 months when he didn't even go to school and just stayed at home and read his father's books, and he was very happy about that. But, then he did move into the future and became the great writer and thinker that he was. Sean says, yes, I remember the visions kind of spooked me. Yeah. There are a lot of things that can spook you in Jungian psychology or Jungian oeuvre. And I think some of you may have seen some of the earlier readings I did from the Red Book, where the ideas just became so overwhelming to me that I just fell asleep. And I don't know why, but sometimes when I'm hearing a sermon or hearing some thinker, let's say a Buddhist thinker or someone like that, sometimes my psyche reacts by just putting me to sleep. I just go, oh, and I just can't keep my eyes open in a church service, especially not during a sermon. So as soon as the sermon starts, I go, so maybe that's the kind of the kind of collapse that Dr. Jung was having. I don't know, but something like that. I don't think it was epilepsy per se. At least I don't recall any specific diagnosis of epilepsy per se. So anyway, thank you everyone for joining me, and tomorrow I'm going to actually read these visions, but I wanted to put out onto the channel at least this rough reading of the commentary so that you can be thinking about what he was saying in his commentary. And then tomorrow I'll begin to read the visions themselves, which will be Mysterium encounters. That's what I'm going to be reading tomorrow. And as I said, those begin on page 174 of the Reader's Edition and on page 245 of the Folio Edition. So, anyway. Okay, I'm going to discontinue for the moment, and I will see you at some point tomorrow. Thank you for joining me.